Hello everybody, I'm Gary, and this is Physical Format Rock and Roll. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. Tonight is going to be another top 5 episode, which I haven't done for a while. For one thing, they're very hard to do. To try to pick a band that I really like and to try to name my top 5 albums. And this one was particularly hard. I'm talking about Judas Priest, one of the most famous bands in metal ever. They kind of took what Black Sabbath had started and started to push it a little bit further to help create a little more modern sounding metal. And now I'm going to do my top 5 albums, but keep in mind, that doesn't mean that some of the albums that I'm not listing I don't love, because I do. I think Judas Priest has a fantastic catalog of albums. They're one of my favorite bands, so just because I don't put one of these bands in my top 5 doesn't mean I don't think that it's an excellent album. And this is just kind of my opinion and where I am now, how I feel about these albums now. You know, if you would ask me 5 years ago, probably would have gave you a different top 5. But at this point, this is where I am. So let's get started. Coming in at number 5, this is from October of 1978. It's actually the second album that Priest put out that year. And I am talking about Killing Machine, or as it was released in America, Hell Bent for Leather, because the record company in America wasn't crazy about the idea of releasing an album called Killing Machine. Just a matter of, 4 years or so after Vietnam, so they weren't too crazy about that. Killing Machine was a bit of a change for Priest in the fact that now they started to get a little more commercial sound to their work. They had some songs with some bigger choruses on there. Even though I think this has a couple of weak tracks, the strong tracks on it are what pushed this album up into my top 5. You've got Delivering the Goods, Hell Bent for Leather, Running Wild, and of course their fantastic remake of The Green Menelishi with the 2-pronged crown. Those are just fantastic Priest songs that belong up there with all of their classics. And this is just a really good, solid album. And Les Spinks plays drums on this one, does a really good job on this particular album. That's number 5. Coming in at number 4, probably a little bit of controversy, I am sure, with some of my friends out here. But I am going with the 2005 comeback album of Angel of Retribution. So this is the album that they made once Rob Halford came back. There's the inside of that. Let's get that cool looking picture. So Tim Ripper Owens made 2 albums with Priest while Halford was out with Fight and 2. And then, of course, he made 2 fantastic albums under the name of Halford, solo albums, which kind of helped forge the sound for this album. To me, this album is just a great album. It starts off with the song Judas Rising, which is a perfect opener for this album. It's perfect in the fact that this was kind of like a comeback album, because the 2 albums that they did with Tim Owens, while they were good albums, they didn't do that well. And, they weren't up to the level of a lot of the other Priest albums. And this album, it's like they came back and said, let's make a classic Judas Priest album. And it gets overlooked so much that it's just incredible. I think that this is a great album. It's got good songs throughout it. Deal with the Devil, Revolution is a little change of pace for them. It's a fantastic song. Worth Fighting For, same way. That's a little bit slightly different for Priest. but totally still in their wheelhouse. Demonizer, Wheels of Fire are more songs you would expect out of Judas Priest. But then they've got a couple songs on here that really help solidify this album and make it special. And that's Angel, which is a ballad until the very end of it, and Eulogy. If you've never heard the song Eulogy by Judas Priest, very moody song, very dark sounding. Rob sings it very well. I love that song. And then it finishes with a controversial song to many Judas Priest fans, and that's Loch Ness. Loch Ness is an over-the-top song that either you love it or you hate it. I fall on the side that loves it. That song is heavy. It goes on. It just pushes everything to the limit. It's this, slow dirge of a song that just builds and builds, and I love it. Coming in at number 3, the first album that they released in 1978, the classic Stained Class. This is a late 70s heavy metal masterpiece. This album was basically the blueprint for what would come next with heavy metal, including thrash. The opening track, Exciter, is close to being like a thrash metal type song. They're all over the place on this. It's fantastic. It's got Better By You, Better Than Me, Stained Class, Invader, Saints in Hell. That's a great Judas Priest song. Savage. And of course, one of the highlights of this album is Beyond the Realms of Death. That's such a classic Judas Priest song. It's one of my favorite songs of theirs, and it just sounds terrific on here. Of course, all these early ones they do on some of the hits on Unleashed in the East, which is a fantastic live album. But I'm just doing studio albums. These are my top 5 studio albums. Okay, no live albums, no greatest hits, anything like that. Number 3, Stained Class. Coming in at number 2. Boy, this is kind of where things really started for Priest. And that's from 1976, Sad Wings of Destiny. This is where Judas Priest found their sound. Their first album, Rock-a-Rolla, is, it's an okay album, but it's definitely a band not sure of their identity yet. And they find it here. I tell you what, this album starts off with Victim of Changes and then The Ripper. That alone is going to push this album up to where it is. But it's not like it just has that. It has so many other songs on here. This is a solid album. It's got Island of Domination. Genocide is on here. Tyrant is on here. But boy, that opening, I never get tired of starting off this album with Victim of Changes and The Ripper. All of, the different time changes and, where it slows down and everything in Victim of Changes. And then the ending is terrific. The Ripper, the beginning, he says, you're in for a surprise. You're in for a shock. And then he does that, what? Thing going on there. And you're like, oh my God. I mean, I can't even imagine, what it must have been like for everybody to hear it right then when it came out. I unfortunately was not into Judas Priest at this point. I was pretty young, just kind of getting into rock and stuff, and I hadn't heard Judas Priest yet at that point. It'd be a few more years before I would get into them. But this, I realized recording wise, it doesn't have the sound of some of their later albums. It has a much earlier, more raw sound to it, but it's just terrific. I love Sad Wings of Destiny. So that's number 2. Number 1, once again, probably some controversy, but my number 1 pick is from 1984, released in January, Defenders of the Faith. I just think that this album has it all. Free Will Burning, Jawbreaker, Rock Hard, Ride Free, The Sentinel, Love Bites, Eat Me Alive, Some Heads Are Gonna Roll, The Night Comes Down, and then, of course, Heavy Duty, going on to Defenders of the Faith. This album, they pushed to a point to where it was almost like Spinal Tap at points, but yet, they managed to somehow make it sound terrific and heavy. They took, to me, like what they had started with Screaming for Vengeance and improved it on this album. I love this album so much. The band sounds great. There's just great stuff from Tipton and Downing. And Rob Halford just is fantastic on this album. Coming in at number 1, Defenders of the Faith. I love it. I love the way it ends with Heavy Duty, and then, going into that big giant chorus of Defenders of the Faith. I know to some people it might sound corny, but I love that. I get into it. There's so much. I never get tired of this album. I've loved this album since it came out. I bought this as soon as it came out, and I've never grown tired of it. So those are my top 5 Judas Priest albums. Like I said, my opinion, where I am now, you might be wondering, God, you didn't even have British Steel or Screaming for Vengeance in your top 5. I love those albums, okay? British Steel, the only thing that's stopping that from being in here is maybe a sometimes a little too commercial sound for me, and the fact that I've heard it so much. So many of those songs on there, not that they're not great songs, it's just I've heard them so much, I'm a little tired of them. I need to keep away from that album for a while and then listen to it, and then it sounds great to me. Screaming for Vengeance, that's great too. I just happen to love these albums better. I just think they're a little bit stronger overall. So that's where I am. Leave your comments below what you think about my picks, what your picks would be. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel, by all means, please do so. My name is Gary. This is Physical Format Rock and Roll. I am also on Twitter and Facebook, so you can get a hold of me there if you want. Until the next time, I will see you all down the road.